everyone. Welcome to Thompson Hine's Coffee Chat. We're here today to discuss the new SEC Rule 2A5, which, as you know, is the valuation rule. My name is JoAnn Strasser. I'm a partner with the Thompson Hine Corporate and Securities Practice Group, and I'm joined today by Julie Roach. Julie is currently the Director of Fund Administration at Diamond Hill Capital Management, and she serves as Treasurer of the Diamond Hill Funds. And prior to Diamond Hill, Julie was VP and Head of Valuation Oversight at JP Morgan Asset Management. And prior to that, was an auditor with Deloitte. So as you can see, lots of valuation experience. I think we're especially lucky to have Julie with us today because she's currently serving as the chair of the ICI's CVOC committee, which stands for Securities Valuation Operations Committee. And I believe she has some great insight and because of her experience as well as her participation with that committee. We wanted today to talk a little bit about the rule and how advisors are approaching it and what advisors need to think about. So before we get into the rule, I'll just mention that if you have any questions or comments, we encourage you to join the discussion by using the Q&A box. And I'll do my best to keep an eye on that box. I'll admit that I'm not great at multitasking. So if I'm talking to Julie and I miss your question, I apologize in advance and we'll try to get an answer to you or respond at the end of the program. So Julie, thanks again for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just spend 2 minutes talking at a very high level about what the rule requires to sort of set the stage, and then we'll dive into some questions we teed up for Julie. The Rule 2A5 is a rule that allows a board to name the investment advisor as its designee, its valuation designee, but it's not required. Regardless of that decision, the rule stipulates that a market quote is readily available only when that market quotation is a price in an active market for identical investments that the fund can access at the measurement date. Anything beyond that is fair valued. And when the board makes a designation at the advisor, it cannot allow the portfolio managers to be overly involved in the process. They have to be segregated from the process. There's, I'd say, 4 core duties under the rule. One is to assess and manage material valuation risks. Second, taking into account those risks, the fund is required to select and apply in a consistent manner appropriate methodologies. We have to review those methodologies periodically. The third piece of it is testing the valuation methodologies, and then the fourth piece is evaluating pricing services. If a board names an advisor as its designee, there are some written reports required under the rule. At least quarterly reports to the board, anything the board wants you to provide to them, as well as a summary of any material fair value matters that came up during the quarter. So that doesn't sound too unusual, probably used to that. And then at least annually an assessment of the risk and effectiveness of the process, and promptly reporting matters that are material valuation issues that come up. And the promptly means within 5 days. So that's a very high level what the rule requires. Julie and I have been talking about the rule a little bit the last couple of weeks and how we're implementing it. So I thought we'd start with the valuation risks. The rule requires an assessment of material risks, including conflicts of interest. And I think the boards generally already look at valuation risk in a number of ways in different contexts throughout the board meetings. But this seems to be a more formal requirement for risk assessment. And how do you think about identifying valuation risk at a fund complex?
So I think JoAnn hit on a great point there that in a lot of ways, firms have already been doing this. It's just probably not a formally documented process. So when I think about valuation risk, to me, that's the baseline for all of the control oversight procedures that you have in place, feeds from there, and thinking about what your valuation risk is. So I think, the way we approach that is looking at, what type of investments your fund complex has, and, tailoring what those risks are, which you probably already have done, and given the types of controls that you have in place and the results that you report to your valuation committees or your boards there. So when we think about that, we think about that broadly, and just kind of maybe focus it on just the valuation process. So in some ways, I think you're kind of back into a little bit of documenting what your valuation risk is based on procedures that you probably already have in place at your fund complex.
So how'd you get started with that? I mean, you've got to put pen to paper, right? And
Right.
actually do that. How would you approach it from the beginning?
So at Diamond Hill, we partnered with our chief compliance and risk officer, because if you think about it, they already have processes in place, for a formal risk assessment overall, and kind of use that framework to narrow down into what our specific valuation risks kind of in that same framework. So, that framework was laying out what risks we identified. Is a risk external, internal? How likely, what's the impact of that risk, the likelihood, and what type of controls are in place to mitigate that risk, and whether, kind of getting into that detail. So we use that framework, and our valuation committee collectively put together, what those risks are, and provided that feedback. And it's something that then got incorporated into that overall risk assessment that our chief compliance and risk officer utilizes, and is evaluated, on an ongoing basis.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about CCO reports where you identify the risk, how likely is it,
Right.
what's the impact, and then what do you do to mitigate it? That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the boards would see some of that in the reporting. We already receive valuation reporting on a quarterly basis. I'm sure all funds do that, and we're also probably looking at pricing services periodically. Do you see this rule impacting board reporting and what you're preparing to give to boards on a quarterly or annual basis?
So I don't see it significantly changing what we're providing to our boards, and I would segregate that specifically related to the quarterly reporting. So, we're already providing our board, as it relates to valuation results of the oversight and monitoring activities, on a high level. A lot of times those are referred to your key valuation indicators, those type of things. And we already provide that kind of in a dashboard format, which seems to be well received by the board. What I anticipate as part of the implementation of the rule is incorporating some of those things that you alluded to in the beginning, where the rule does require informing the board quarterly of any changes to, any material changes to risk assessments, changes to valuation methodologies, those type of things. So what I see is an enhancement to that dashboard of highlighting, affirmatively saying there were no changes, or if there were, specifying that. So kind of adding that to the quarterly reporting. And then I think that annual reporting will be a new report. And I liken it to the annual report that we provide to the board related to our assessment of liquidity risk and the effectiveness of our liquidity risk management program. So I kind of view those as two components. One, will enhance our quarterly, and then create this annual report. And for us, we'll time that along with when the board typically reviews and approves our valuation policy on an annual basis. And incorporate that, so we can highlight, some more of those annual, and providing some, trending information, those type of things, to enhance the role there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I think for funds that really have significant fair value securities every quarter, whether it's a private fund or anything that's really level three, which we see a fair amount of, particularly in the interval funds we work with, which we price every day. But in those situations, the board's required to approve the value for each that we struck that month, that quarter, and the fair value committee minutes are pretty robust and detailed and takes a lot of board time because they want to understand it at a pretty granular level. So I suspect that some of that will go away because if you are going to name the advisor as the designee, they own it. And then I'm hoping we can get to more of a dashboard or just reporting on changes. So if we fair value a private, a non-traded equity, and we mark it to a comparable company, for ups and downs through the market cycle, and that's the method, and we set it that way, then we're done. And we're not going to look at it every quarter at the board level, but the advisors still have to be looking at it daily and quarterly, whatever, to make sure it's still working. But once we, I think the board's going to approve methodologies at a high level, like non-traded securities are going to be marked to an index, and then it's up to the advisor to implement. So we could see some for the level three securities. I'm hoping we'll see less reporting, but it's also going to be what the board is comfortable with, what fund counsel's used to, what independent counsel wants. So it could be a lot of variety, I suppose, across the board.
I know my past experience, counsel never likes to take away from reporting, but I do think that when I think about reporting, I think about putting myself in the board's shoes and what is the board's responsibility? They have designated the valuation committee, which whoever the designee is, to oversee the process. So it's my responsibility to give them enough information, but not overload, so that they can apply the appropriate oversight. And I need, as I think about it, I need to think about what are, they've seen our assessment of valuation risks, how we're responding to those, specifically highlighting conflicts of interest as well, and how you're addressing those, and being able to provide the reporting so they can do their due diligence over the work that we've done. In a lot of ways, I like it to it, since I was a former auditor, of how do I present to my audit firm when they're coming in to do their audit each year, enough detail so that they can, do their independent analysis as well. So in a lot of ways, I think that's very similar of how you put that together for the board. And I do think it's important to engage your board, ask them, consistently ask for feedback. Hopefully most of your boards are pretty vocal and active to tell you what they want to see or what they don't want to see. But in this day and age, boards are very active in participating in industry groups, and they talk to one another. Your audit committee chairs are attending meetings with other audit committee chairs, and they're kind of sharing some best practices. There's a lot of industry surveys out there that you can participate in as well to kind of benchmark yourself. And I think it's always good to do that. But the rule does give you this opportunity to kind of take a fresh look of, maybe practices that you've always done and see if there's ways to improve.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking about industry information. It's so prevalent and helpful. And, in this whole area of valuation risk, it's just, I think really is kind of a new way to think about this area. And there was a Deloitte survey. I don't know if you saw that one, but this was that one area where most respondents recognized they had a big gap, that they might do valuation risk assessment, but it's very informal. It's just inherent in the daily pricing process, or like you said, Julie, it's already baked in a lot of procedures we already have, and those are there because of risks.
Right.
but articulating that in a formal place is definitely new. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about pricing services, because the rule is specific on this. You have to evaluate pricing services. And there's specific requirements about doing initial diligence as well as ongoing. And I wanted to ask you if you had any suggestions on how advisors might approach that in light of the rule.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that, that there's such a unique relationship with the funds, in that the business relationship with the pricing service is often through your administrator.
Exactly.
To do that. So it's important to be proactive with your administrator to make sure you're getting the necessary information. And I think, through the rule, the definition of vendor due diligence is expanded, because, typically when someone thinks of vendor due diligence, they think, I'm going to schedule a meeting or a call, and, the pricing service is going to come in. They have their kind of standard deck to walk through their methodologies and the capabilities and business continuity and all those type of things to check the box. But I think it's important to combine that as you're thinking about documenting not just those types of meetings, but taking into account a lot of the other work that you're probably already doing, or your administrator might be doing on a day-to-day basis. So as you're looking at day-over-day tolerance breaks, for example, or you're doing transaction testing for back testing purposes, or you might do vendor-to-vendor comparisons, or you analyze price challenges. All of those to me are components of vendor due diligence. So the price challenges is an easy one. The pricing vendors are always going to share with you how they view their results of price challenges, but I think you also need to look at your own internal results and consider that as a component of your pricing vendor due diligence. Transaction testing specifically, I think most firms do their own individual transaction testing to compare your own individual trades to the results of how the pricing vendors took that into account. So I think bringing all those pieces together and packaging it as a whole, versus just thinking about, well, I met with the pricing vendor and this is what they shared, and we asked these questions and those type of things.
That is really good advice, Julie. I hadn't thought about it that way, because when you getting your arms around diligence, these meetings, when they do a little presentation to the board, doesn't do much. And there was recently a pretty significant valuation case that was announced, and that relates to a pricing service, and at least maybe what appears to be maybe a misunderstanding about what the pricing service was actually doing. Because when I read it, so it sounds like they were more like a calculation agent, not a pricing agent, because they were taking the inputs from the advisor or a PM and then cranking out the numbers, but not looking behind the curtain, at what was going into the model. And if we do see very disposal variance reports or transaction testing, like, okay, we priced it at X and we sold it at Y. We see those variance reports. We compare different vendors maybe for the same type of bond, who's doing a better job. How many price challenges do we have to actually submit because things aren't going well? If you're doing a price challenge, maybe it indicates it could be more than a disagreement. It could be like, we think pricing service isn't doing a good job on that particular type of security. So you're right. I mean, pulling all that together in a report saying, based on challenges, this is what we're seeing. Based on a side-by-side comparison of two different vendors, here's what we're seeing. Disposal variances, here's what we're seeing. And for that asset class would give you a really good picture of how that pricing service is behaving and performing. Input from your auditor on what pricing services they're seeing being effective for different asset classes. So I can imagine sort of what I'm thinking about, Julie, is I was taking notes because I'm thinking I'm going to build maybe a little checklist or a template or boards and or advisors might try to use to build that kind of a pricing service assessment. What are you hearing with your activities with ICI and that committee? You're probably hearing things about pricing services and how they're responding to the rule.
So last month, the ICI pulled together a meeting to allow each of the main pricing vendors, 15, 20 minutes to kind of share how they're tackling Rule 2A5. And so I would say in general, all those pricing vendors are planning on providing, detail to be able to have everyone have regular updates that are dispersed, without, kind of a lot of times you have to say, oh, can I have the latest methodology binder or this or that? So being able to disperse to all clients information in an easy manner. And, because of that kind of issue where the relationship with the pricing vendor may be with your administrator, they do, most of them seem to recognize that and will be providing, let's say, a login to several of the pricing vendors mentioned providing a login to their systems for anyone. So, while let's say Diamond Hill doesn't have a direct relationship with pricing vendor A and our service provider does, through the service provider, they'll provide that information to us. So I think it's important to be proactive with your administrator to make sure you have access to, that basic information of pricing methodologies, getting those updates when there are changes, and those type of things. So I know that several of the pricing vendors are offering, additional services, certainly at a cost if you wanted to provide. But I think some of the basic tenets of what you really need to comply with the rule are available free of charge. You just need to reach out and make sure that you have access to that information.
Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about that topic in the context of series trusts, because in a series trust you might have 10 or 15 or 20 advisors. And I'm quite sure they're going to be relying pretty heavily on the administrator. We're also talking about whether the board will name the advisor as the designee, valuation designee, with respect to level 2 securities at all, because of this diligence process. And you can imagine at a fund complex, if there are 20 advisors or they're all evaluating the pricing service, it doesn't seem very efficient. And then also, do you want inconsistency among the fund complex where advisor A thinks that we should use this pricing service for corporate bonds and another advisor wants to use a different pricing service? Maybe that's okay because the feeds are set up anyway. Maybe that's a real challenge operationally. Maybe it's more risk because you've got different prices on the same security in the same fund family, which the adopting release recognizes that could happen. So that's not fatal in any way, but it does sort of get pretty inefficient and complicated. And I don't think the pricing services want to talk to, 5,000 advisors every year about what they do, for sure. Not that that's our problem, but it is a practical problem to get their attention and get the right information.
I do think that because of COVID, the pricing vendors did adapt and provided more, we'll say quarterly updates, those type of things through the webcasts or things like that, so that you can, log in, glean that information and document it for your complex. But it is important. And I think the other thing to think about too is that while you may use one pricing vendor mainly, you certainly have tertiary vendors as well. And there's no distinction that says in the guidance that you only do due diligence over one. You have to do due diligence all over all pricing vendors. So,
good point.
We may use a tertiary vendor to price, 10, 20 securities, but we still need to make sure that we have that process documented in place. And so I think it's important, to be able to, build that case to analyze the detail. And just, like one simple thing that we did, I think years ago, industry recommended boards review price challenges for bias and ask, your report, how many did you challenge up? How many did you challenge down, type of thing. And that's something we provided. Well, in the last year, we started reporting more specifically about challenge results by pricing vendor, to incorporate that so they could, kind of see that detail going forward as well.
I'm taking notes because you always say something. I'm like, oh, I should remember that. I should incorporate that. We're working on procedures right now, and what we're working on is a sample procedure which is finished. We've got this one done, where the board's designating the advisor to do all the pricing work on their behalf. We're also working on a model where only level 3 is being designated. And then we're also working on a model where the board's just going to own it the way they do now, but we still have to comply with 2A5. So we have to revise procedures to address the valuation risk assessment, ongoing diligence on pricing services, and some of the things we already do, but it has to be in the policy. And it's a challenge. So we're kind of nicking away at this because every fund complex has a different situation. And so before we run out of time, I want to at least touch briefly on the segregation of portfolio managers from the process. The rule requires that the advisor segregate fair value determinations from portfolio management such that the portfolio managers may not determine or effectively determine by exerting substantial influence on the fair values. In other words, the PMs can participate, but they can't make any determinations. And that's tough with a small advisory firm. It's tough with a big advisory firm, even maybe because PMs are the experts purportedly on what they're buying. So what are you thinking? What are you hearing about this aspect of the rule? How are we going to segregate PMs? Are they still going to be participate at all, or are they completely excluded?
I think that is a key area that some people are struggling with, depending on your size. I would say in general, most people have, if they previously included portfolio management as a member of your valuation committee, they have now removed them as a member, but they do attend meetings and provide input. So I think it's to a degree almost a perception. Like, do you have a process in place? Because I think they're a key part. They're managing the portfolios. They know those investments inside and out. You need their data and input to evaluate for price challenges. We specifically highlight in our policy that they have a responsibility to alert the valuation committee if there is a situation where they believe that an evaluated price or market price may not be reflective of fair value. Just like with liquidity, if they identify an issue, they have to notify, and that's a key responsibility. So I think it really comes down to, do you have someone that can, in essence, be a control, be that professional skeptic that can take the input and recommendation, challenge it. If you're giving me information from one broker, did you go out to other brokers? What's your relationship with that broker who's providing you the input? Like asking those types of questions to challenge and then provide an overriding decision, and being the valuation designee, being the one that instructs the fair value and not allowing the portfolio manager to, let your administrator know what that fair value that they want to utilize. So I think it's just having that top layer of oversight and, asking those questions, just like your board would ask, or that your auditor would ask, those type of things to challenge that you're actually getting the correct information. And then, if you think about it, you have those tools in place to test later. So if your portfolio manager is providing a recommendation for an override of an evaluated price or change, in your fair valuing, maybe once you sell that security or you switch back to a vendor, like what are those, post test results? And if they're in line, I think that's a good validation that you got accurate data. And if it's not, then you have to question, well, what did we miss? What did we not consider? And consider whether you need to update your policies on an ongoing basis. And I think that's the spirit of the rule, what it wants for you to recognize that the portfolio manager does have a conflict and not just take for granted what they provide, and make sure you have controls in place to, challenge the data, make sure you have accurate data, see if there's ways to independently validate the data to make a good decision in line with your policy. And you don't need to be a portfolio, I don't think, you don't need to be a portfolio expert to provide that oversight. You just need to have the skills to do the oversight.
Yeah, the professional skepticism, as you,
right,
that's inherent in the audit function. It has to be sort of inherent in this as well. Okay, well, I think we are a minute over time. We could talk a long time about this. And I know we all have a lot of work ahead of us in the coming weeks. The rule is effective in September and probably warrants a little early adoption so you can get some weeks or months under your belt before it's effective to make sure you're in compliance. And by closing remarks, I'll just mention we do these coffee chats every couple of weeks. If you missed a past conversation, and we encourage you to look at our library of recordings that's available on our Thompson Hines website and the YouTube channel. We want to thank you all for attending today's program, and especially Julie for sharing your insights. When the webinar ends, you'll be prompted to take a survey providing feedback, and we would appreciate that very much. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And Julie, I'll talk to you soon.